Welcome to view this video on Pelikan Nibs. We will review a sample of nibs, mostly vintage, but some modern nibs as well. I found that there is no video that comprehensively compares these nibs, so this is my attempt to provide such a video. I hope you like it. Just bear in mind that there is lots of variability in the manufacturing process of these old nibs, and that during the past 70 years or so, these nibs have been worn in different ways. So if you get a nib based on this video, it could be different than what you see here. That's just a fact of life and part of the hobby. Okay? All of the writing samples you'll see are written on a Rhodia 80-gram paper, and they all use Waterman Mysterious Blue ink. So, let us start with this nib. This is a nib that's installed in a Pelikan 140, and it's an extra fine nib. It's stamped extra fine. Writes like this. The downstroke is like 0.3 millimeters, and the side stroke is roughly the same, maybe slightly less. But it's certainly an extra fine nib, not a needle point, but an extra fine. And like all 1950s Pelikan nibs, this is a soft, springy nib. You can get some line variation out of it, but it requires some force, and it's difficult to control, or not super difficult, but a proper flex nib is better in this regard. But if you really pay attention and go slow, you can write some nice text like this. So the next pen is a Pelikan 500, and the nib is stamped KF, which stands for round fine. But as we can see, it's not round at all. Downstroke is like 0.4 millimeters, and the side stroke is 0.2 millimeters, roughly speaking. So it happens that someone has ground this to a stub nib, a very sharp stub actually. So just a reminder that when you buy a pen without seeing a writing sample like I did, you could get something totally different than what you would deduce from the stamping on the nib. And this is a soft nib as well. Writes like this. You can definitely see the line variation way better than with the Pelikan 140. The next nib is installed in a Pelikan 100N from the early 1940s, and the nib itself is unmarked, but the feed says F, so let's call it a fine nib then, although as you can see it's very narrow. So the downstroke is like 0.3 millimeters, maybe even less if you compare it to this Pelikan 140 sample. Side stroke, I don't know, 0.2 2 millimeter, maybe slightly less. So definitely an extra fine nib. And it's springy, somewhat flexible. Still wouldn't call it a flex nib because you need to exert some force to get line variation, but somehow this is more responsive than this other nibs we had previously. Like that. But someone really knew what they were doing when they made this nib. It certainly connects to the paper in a way that it's difficult to put into words, but it's certainly much more responsive, better tactile feel than in these other nibs. The next nib is our first modern nib. So this is from a Pelikan 205 and it's stamped F. It's a steel nib. And it's certainly a fine nib. Downstroke is like 0.4 millimeters, as well as the side stroke. It's a round nib and it truly is based on the writing. And it's a stiff nib. I won't attempt to get any line variation out of it. This is not for that. The writing looks like this. And an absolute joy to use. Certainly a hassle-free nib. Excellent for note taking. The final fine nib we have here is from a Pelikan M400. Although this is installed on a vintage body. And it's a fine stub nib which has been customized. So originally this nib was too wide for my tastes. It was more like a medium. So I sent this to John Soroka and he ground it down to a fine stub nib. And the downstroke is like 0.5 millimeters, side stroke maybe 0.3 millimeters. Maybe someone would count this as a medium stub, but I say it's a fine. Excellent writer, very smooth, but as it's not so sharp as some of the previous nibs we had, it means that the line variation doesn't stand out that well. Our first medium nib is installed on this pen, which is a Franken Pelikan. And this is actually quite interesting. So the body is from a Pelikan 140. It says 140 here. But the cap is not original. It's from a Taylorix pen. Moreover, the nib is from a Pelikan 400. And now they will tell you online that this Pelikan 400 nib, it will fit the barrel of a Pelikan 140. The threadings are the same, but they will tell you that it won't fit the cap. And that's true. You see, I have here a Pelikan 140. So you can see that the nib is definitely shorter and actually somewhat narrower. But it will actually fit this Taylorix cap perfectly. Anyway, let's have a look at the writing sample. So I will write Pelikan 400, because that's where the nib is from. The nib is stamped KM, so it's a round medium nib. Downstroke is like 0.5 millimeters, and side stroke is roughly the same. The nib is flexible. You can get some line variation out of it. Like this nib very much. It's nice and soft and has good ink flow. The next medium nib is installed on a Pelikan .400NN, and the nib is medium cursive italic nib. So the original nib was stamped KM, but it was truly terrible, and I had it ground to cursive italic by fpnibs.com. Writes like this. Has lots of natural line variation. Downstroke is like 0.5 millimeters, say slightly more. And the side stroke, I don't know, difficult to measure, 0.1 millimeters, maybe even less. And while this nib is somewhat soft, I wouldn't say it's flexible, so I won't attempt to flex it. Doesn't make too much sense with a cursive italic nib anyway. Like that. Our final medium nib is a superb nib. So it's installed on a Pelikan 100 from the early 1940s. It's a medium nib. Writing looks like this. Or it's a stub nib. Downstroke is 0.5 millimeters, slightly more. And the side stroke is 0.2 millimeters, I would say slightly more than that. And this pen has a very flexible nib. So without any pressure, I have this. And then when you start pushing, you get more and more. So here I used roughly the same amount of pressure as with the previous nibs. If I pressed more, I could probably get more line variation, but I don't want to do that. So with quite a little pressure, you get this line. It's very nice and responsive. So let's write something. Have to be careful here. It's so responsive that it's very hard not to flex it. So that's normal writing. And then let's use some flex. Very nice. Definitely one of my better nibs installed on a very nice pen. Then we will look at broad nibs. This is probably something you've been waiting for. First nib is on a Pelikan 100N, and like I said, it's a broad nib, and it's a round broad nib. Downstroke 0.6 millimeters, say slightly more. Side stroke, it's the same. And this nib, it's somewhat soft or flexible. You can flex it, but it's not as enjoyable because this is already quite broad. So normal writing looks like this. Maybe I should write a bit bigger. And flex writing like this. But like I said, it's already quite broad, it's wet and it's round, so you won't get a dramatic effect. So flexing is pretty pointless with this, but it's nice. It's a nice bouncy nib. Like I said, very wet, very nice writer, super smooth. Next up we have a modern nib. It's installed on Pelikan M600, and it's a broad nib which has been ground to a stub nib by niche pens. Downstroke is 0.6 millimeters and side stroke 0.3 millimeters. And like all modern Pelikan nibs, this is a stiff nib, so no flexing. Sample writing like so. Very nice nib. I like this. The only drawback is that this is slightly dry nib, but actually it's sometimes good if you have a well lubricated ink. So such inks don't really go well with these vintage fire hose nibs I found, but they are pretty good with this one. So with this particular ink, it doesn't really go well with this nib, but some, say, Iroshizuku inks are just a joy to write with in this pen. Final broad nib is the most interesting nib in my opinion. It's installed on a Pelikan 400, and this is a double broad nib. Just look at this. It's a double broad italic nib. Downstroke 0.9 millimeters and side stroke 0.2 millimeters. So it gives lots of natural line variation. It looks very nice. And it's even flexible, if it makes any sense. But you can easily flex it to triple broad width, like that. And even though it's an italic nib, it's a very smooth writer and very wet nib. I really enjoy using this one. One of my best purchases. Our first oblique nib is installed with Pelikan 400 NN, and the nib is it's an oblique fine nib. Produces line like this. So the diagonal stroke from right to left is something like 0.1 millimeter, maybe slightly more. Then the horizontal stroke is roughly 0.3 millimeters. And then the diagonal stroke from left to right is 0.4 millimeters. What about flexibility? Well, I don't see any point in flexing a oblique nib, so I won't do it. This nib actually is quite stiff, so you wouldn't get much line variation out of it anyway. And this nib writes like this. So it's a very fine nib, actually quite a finicky nib. It's difficult to write with. I don't really like this for journaling, but if you had a better ink, this ink doesn't really fit any of my obliques. If you had a better ink, then and you wrote slowly, then you would get some nice text out of this. Next up, we have a Pelikan 400 with an oblique medium nib. Writes like this. The diagonal stroke from left to right is 0.6 millimeters, say slightly less. Diagonal stroke from right to left is 0.2 millimeters, maybe again slightly less. And the horizontal stroke is 0.4 millimeters. You get significant line variation out of this. Very nice. And this is actually quite a soft, springy nib. I like the feel of it, but I won't flex it. It writes like this. The final oblique nib is on a Pelikan 400. It's an oblique broad nib, a very nice nib, very good flow, very nice line variation. I like it. So the diagonal stroke from left to right is 0.8 millimeters, maybe even more. The other diagonal stroke from right to left is roughly 0.2 millimeters, so quite thin compared to this other diagonal. And the horizontal stroke is roughly 0.6 millimeters. So this gives you lots of line variation like this. And this is actually quite flexible nib. Maybe I will show it. So this is the normal diagonal stroke, and if you push it a bit, you get something like this. But like I said, flexing obliques doesn't really make too much sense. Difficult to do it if you want to apply equal amount of pressure on both tines. So not really practical. And let's then have our final writing sample. Like that.